This morning I'll be reading from 1 Samuel, the 18th chapter, beginning in verse 1, if you'd like to follow along. I will be reading from the New King James Version. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David, with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants.
So love is thicker than blood. You might recognize the phrase of that. It's connected to our proverb that says, blood is thicker than water, which refers to the fact that our familial connections are stronger than every other connection. Now, I don't think that's generally true, but, well, it might be generally true. I don't know that it's always true. I do think other relationships often become stronger than even the family. Our spouses may not be related to us by blood, but they often become the strongest relationship and the greatest bond we ever have in our life. And one of the things that scriptures show us is that love does not stop at family relationships. That in fact, godly love truly has to move beyond that, and that the bond of love is greater and stronger than the bond of family. And one of the examples of that we're going to look at today is Jonathan and David. And I just put up there 1 Samuel 18:3, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. That passage that's already been read for us comes right on the heels of David having defeated Goliath. So he wasn't yet a man, he was really a teenager. And Jonathan might be a bit older. He actually gives him his armor. So he might be 20 or something, might be a few years older, but Jonathan loved David. And David loved Jonathan. And there it's actually said that they loved one another more than they loved a wife. That their bond was so strong, that their friendship and their connection was so strong that in fact Jonathan turned against his own family. And rejected his own family. And he even rejected his own heritage because of his love for David. We're going to look at that in a minute. I want to remind us, I mentioned a while back, our theme verse really comes from John 15, love like Jesus. By this they will know. Now, the definition of love is to seek the good of another or the goodwill towards somebody else. But in 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 8, what you see is love is defined in two things. My motivation to actually help another, and then actually helping them. It's not love if I'm simply motivated, oh, I should do that, and then you don't do it. It's like, you ever been like driving down and somebody's broken down on the side of the road, and you're like, oh, I should stop, and you don't? Well, how much help was it that you felt you should have stopped to the person who was broken down on the side of the road? None, right? Because the motivation that stops and doesn't actually act is kind of empty. And so, but he also tells us that sometimes we can do things that people think or look like they are motivated by love, that they're good actions, but our intentions, our motives are really different. That maybe we have an ulterior motive to look like we are loving other people. And when we do that, it doesn't really benefit me the way godly love truly benefits me. But I also want to there's one verse I want to look at and kind of add right here. And I want to talk about this just a little bit because of a side note. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, he said, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. In due season kind of refers to the idea that when the harvest is ripe, then I'll go and we don't go and grab all of the harvest before it's ripe, right? I mean, you go get the apples off the tree, but they're not ripe. It's like, well, what good was that? That didn't taste very good. You go, get strawberries, or you go pluck the vegetables, and you're like, well, that didn't taste good at all, because it wasn't ripe. It wasn't due season. And so we all reap in due season, when it's right. Sometimes, though, we have to wait for that due season. And he says, we reap, though, if we don't give up. But notice that in the passage, in verse 9, that there is a tendency to get tired of doing good, right? If you are helping other people, you will get tired. You will, because you're working, right? When you go to work and you do it for a paycheck, you get tired because you're working. And when we are loving other people, we are going to get tired of that from time to time. And he says, he's urging us in Galatians 6, don't give up. There is a reward, there is a benefit to it, but sometimes it doesn't happen right away. I'm thinking a lot about, all those around us right now. We've got a lot of people who are in our congregation, and certainly all over the world, who are caring for elderly parents in different stages of needing help. And obviously Jennifer and her sister is taking care of her mother, and very often she doesn't remember them, most of us, we want to see our mother, and we want our mother to light up when she sees us, and we want her to remember us, and when she doesn't do that, there's a little bit of pain there. And yet, to care for her and love her anyway is tough. It's work. It's tiring work. And yet there is a payoff. It doesn't always happen soon, though. It doesn't always happen quickly. I remember a woman in Arizona many years ago whose husband was suffering from Alzheimer's, and we didn't see her for 3 years. She never came. Didn't come to worship. She didn't. And I didn't know her really well, but after her husband passed, she was coming, and she was a wonderful woman, and yet I didn't get to meet her for 3 years because her husband could only really stand her presence and her daughter's presence just for a little while. And so she was, living in a house with all the doors locked from the inside with a key, so he couldn't get out. And he didn't know her, and for 3 years, 24 hours a day, she took care of him. And he didn't know her. And he was often angry. And he wasn't easy. But she had committed her life to him till death do us part. Well, the last 3 years of that till death do us part was really hard. And yet, the blessings of having known she has done that has a reward. And I want you to think about this from the standpoint. If I were to ask you, or if I were to say to you, boy, I've really been blessed today, what would you assume has happened to me? I would think most of the time we assume that that person who says, I've been blessed today, has received something wonderful, right? Because that's almost always the way we use it. Would we say, I've been really blessed today because I had the chance to help somebody? We don't usually say it in that vein. And yet, remember what Jesus said in the book of Acts? Paul tells us that Jesus said it is better, or it's more blessed to give than to receive. So it is a greater blessing to be able to love others than to receive love. Now, when you're a little kid, you don't think that way. When you're young, you want to receive. You want stuff. And when you get it, you love it. But as we grow, we often realize that the greatest joy we ever get is when we actually help other people. when we give something to other people. When we see maybe little kids, give them the gift and see their face light up, we almost get more joy than when we were that little kid and received it. And you know, an hour later, we were playing with the box and not caring about the toy. But as the giver is more blessed than the receiver. And I want you to think back to things that you have done that maybe have been hard, but you did them for the right reasons, to care and love for other people. And think about what came back to you because of that. Was there not a great deal and a great sense of accomplishment? Was there not a sense that that felt really good? Even though I might be really tired. Sometimes it's a happy tired. You know, you go out and do something and you work hard for somebody, and then maybe that you're kind of exhausted, but you feel really good. Totally different than that feeling we sometimes have when we might not be exhausted, have lots of energy, and we haven't done anything. And so love is more blessed to give it than even to receive it. Now, in the context of Jonathan and David, and I'd like you to turn with me to 1 Samuel 18, and we're going to read the first 5 verses here again, but in verse 17, David had come. The armies of the Philistines and Israel were embattled, and this giant of a soldier had challenged Israel, anybody in Israel, to come and fight me, and we will determine who wins and loses by this battle. And nobody in Israel would go do it. And Saul was probably 8 to 12 inches taller than most Israelite men, which probably put him somewhere in the 6'3", 6'4" range or so. And he was terrified. He's not doing it. Well, I'm the king. I'm not going to do that. Of course, God is supposed to be with him, and yet we know he isn't. We've already been told of David being anointed the next king. God has left Saul and transitioned his power, his care, his working through to David. And so after David defeated Goliath, Saul kind of didn't let him go home, takes him with him. And as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. One of the things you notice in this passage is that everybody recognized something was special about David. It's like, wow, he can do things that normal people can't do. And so it appears that they are aware that God is with him, that God is doing things through David and using him. And so Saul is using David because God is with him. Jonathan, though, appears to recognize that fact, that God is with David. So this is really quite fascinating, because who is next in line to be king in Israel? Not from God having anointed David perspective, but just in kind of understanding how monarchies happen. Jonathan is expected to be the next king by most people, because he's the eldest son of the king. And here, as the eldest son of the king, he will care more about David than he will his own power and his own prestige and his own heritage, his own inheritance, his own rightful place to be the next king. And so we see Jonathan and David making this connection. David even marries, Jonathan's sister, Michal, Saul's daughter. We're going to skip over all that, but I would like you to look at the first 7 verses of chapter 19. Because what we have when David went out and he was successful and he's doing everything, it tells us in verse 7 of chapter 18 that there began to be a song that was sung. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, I don't know, and I actually expect that not to be literal numbers. They both have defeated people, but I don't think at this point that David has necessarily defeated 10,000 people. But the point is not literal numbers. The point is saying who's more powerful. And David is getting a greater reputation than their king Saul. And Saul, it infuriates him, makes him angry. And so he begins to hate David. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son in chapter 19, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. So here he's got this servant in his household that he sends him everywhere he sends him. It's like he prospers, he does good. It's like he wins. It's like, and he serves Saul faithfully. And yet, he's like, we got to kill this guy. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul my father seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. So Jonathan was able to change his father's mind. He was able to reason with him and help him see how unreasonable he was being and how sinful he would have been to attack David. And so he relented. Now, he didn't relent forever, but next time he wants to kill David, he learned something. I'm not going to tell Jonathan. Because he knows Jonathan loves David. And if I want to kill David, I better not let Jonathan know about it. So the first time that Jonathan saved David's life, David was unaware that Saul wanted to kill him. Jonathan knew, Saul's servants knew, but Jonathan heard his father and stopped his father. He protected David from his father. Now, as we move ahead into chapter 20, because from this point we have, in chapter 19, there was war again. David went out, fought with the Philistines, struck them with a great blow, so that they fled before him. Then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, verse 9 of chapter 19. As he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre, because that's actually what brought David to Saul's house, was Saul suffered from depression, what seems kind of like depression, and they had chosen David, who they said was an incredibly handsome young man, but who could also sing and play music incredibly well. So he actually had come initially into to just help the mood of Saul. And so there he is, David has now been going out with the men of war, having all these great victories, and Saul is sitting there with his spear, and there's David playing the lyre, and he says, this harmful spirit came over him. He sat in his house, spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre, and Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. Kind of an interesting way of saying he threw a spear at him and tried to kill him. Right? And David avoided it and got out of there. So he begins to flee. And then he even has to flee from his wife, Michal. She actually helps him too to get away. And then in chapter 20, David fled from Naioth and Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What's my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" So David at this point has come to Jonathan, and he thinks Jonathan is aware that his father's trying to kill him again. But Jonathan at this point isn't. And so he said to him, "Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me." Well, apparently that was no longer true. And so, because what had Saul realized? Why was Saul not disclosing this to his son, who was his right hand? He would have disclosed everything to him, which is what Jonathan thought. Why isn't he doing it? Because Saul realizes his allegiance is greater to David than it was to himself. Which is true, by the way. And so, he goes on, and why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. But David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes." And he thinks, "Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." He said, "Listen, I'm running for my life. I'm running." Now think about this for a second. You're not just running from your life from somebody who wants to kill you. You're running for your life from the ruler of the nation who's got a guard and army he can send after you to kill you. That's not the same thing as just some guy hating you. He's got resources to send after you. And so David is well aware, he's like, there's this little teeny gap between me and death. And so he's reaching out to Jonathan. And Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." You see that? I mean, that right there, I'm going to do whatever you need. That was love. That was motivated by love, and that was the actions of love. Because sometimes our families don't do the right thing. Right? In fact, in the law of Moses, it actually was very explicit that if you saw somebody doing something wrong, remember, that was written for a time. There's no police force or anything like that. So when people harmed others, it had to be brought by witnesses. You had to actually accuse people. They did that. You didn't just call police. Somebody had to accuse them. And the law was very explicit that even if it is your relative or your BFF, you have to accuse them. And sometimes our family isn't right. But also sometimes we get so kind of caught up in our tribe, our family, or our group, that even when our group does terrible things, we kind of defend them. Or we don't accuse them of doing terrible things. Well, they're our group. I don't want to accuse my own group. You see that in politics constantly, right? I mean, every politician, Republican and Democrat alike, ends up kind of being hypocrites because some things that Democrats once did, then Republicans do it, and then, but what happens is, when you're on the other side, you accuse the other people of being horrible because they've done something bad. But then when your own side does it, you don't say it, you kind of mitigate it, and you kind of reason, that's not as bad, because they're about winning an advantage for their group. People often have that trouble as well. But it's more important, if we truly want to love, to actually uphold what is right and truthful, even when it's our own or those who are close to us. Like Jonathan had done. He said his father was going to sin had he killed David. His father, aware of it, and yet still doesn't change, gives you a sense of who Saul really was, especially as he got older. But he says, whatever you say I'll do. David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at table with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field till the third day at evening. So he basically says, listen, let me go for 3 days. And I'm supposed to be there. I'm one of the people that's supposed to be at the table with the king. And if I'm not there, something's wrong. But he's asking Jonathan, you let me go. Because Jonathan is kind of like second in charge. He's like, you say that you let me go away. You gave me permission to do this. And he says, if your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the clan. If he says good, it will be well with your servant. But if he is angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. That's something we'd already read, that there was actually a covenant between David and Jonathan. They had an agreement that they would take care of one another, and they would love one another and provide for each other. And so he says, but if there is guilt in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? And Jonathan said, far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you? And then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you roughly? And Jonathan said to David, come, let us go out into the field. So they both went out into the field. Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you, as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Now I want you to just focus for a moment on those last couple of statements Jonathan made, because that actually tells you Jonathan knows exactly the danger he's in this situation. If it's true that his father is still now hunting down and trying to kill David, his BFF, then he is going to end up between his father and his friend. And he is going to side with his friend. But you don't side against the king without risk of life. And he is aware of that. That in fact, that his father Saul will become the enemy of David. But Jonathan has been fully aware that the Lord is with David. And Jonathan also seems to be completely aware that being the enemy of the one whom the Lord is with is not a very good place to be. And so he says, if I'm still alive. So notice in his own mind, he's thinking, this may cause my death. He says, show me the steadfast love that I may not die. So if I'm still alive, please don't kill me. Now, do you know why he's saying that? Because why would you expect your friend to kill you? But typically, if one monarch is going to be killed by somebody else and that other person is going to become king, which David has already been anointed to be king, they typically killed their entire families. Royal families generally were all killed when one family took over for another one. It was not good to be related to the king if he fell. And so he's basically pleading with David, listen, if my father falls, please don't kill me. And so, but he doesn't stop there. He says, do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever. Now that's actually interesting, because later on when David does become king, he is going to seek out those members of Saul's household to actually take care of them. David will fulfill this promise that Jonathan asked of him, to take care of my family. Because one of the things, if you don't already know, and many of you probably are aware of this, that when Saul does die and is killed, that his son Jonathan will be killed too in battle. And so there won't be a lot of people left in Saul's household. But there is one for David to go and care for. And David will keep this covenant because he loved Jonathan just like Jonathan loved him. So both of them, they put up, they gave. See, when David later on actually takes a member of Saul's household and provides for him and cares for him and keeps him alive, he's doing something kings generally did not do. Because that person could always come around and tell the nation, I'm the rightful king. I'm the one who's the rightful next in line for the king, not that person. And that's why they didn't leave blood relatives alive. And so Jonathan made this covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. That's actually a pretty big sentence. He's fully aware that that may be his father's household. He doesn't, at this point in time, he doesn't know if that's true, that his father is an enemy of David. But he is at the end of all this being told that your father's trying to kill me, he says, may the Lord take vengeance on his enemies. He knows his father may be the one he's talking about there. You see the love Jonathan had and how it overcame the blood relationship he had with his father, the heritage he had through his father, the connections and the power and the wealth and all of those things that he had because of his father being the king. He said, all those things are nothing because of the love I have for David. And because David is on the Lord's side. Now, we just kind of remind ourselves, he rejects his father and his heritage because of this love. Because his love was rooted in what was good and what was right. We're not talking about love that is just something I like, something I prefer. We're talking about those things. We're talking about godly love. We're talking about seeking that which is good and right and true. And that's what Jonathan did. It's what David did for Jonathan's family afterwards. And that's the example God has given to us to make sure that all of our connections, all of our relationships are not guided by preference or partiality or blood, but by love. That's what we've been called to be in Christ, to love one another as Christ loved us. And we know Christ loved his disciples to the end, right? He loved them right up till the very end. And what is one of the things he said to one of those most prominent disciples in Peter? Get behind me, Satan. Jesus' love was not always easy to take. And it wasn't always pleasant, but it was always right. And it was always good. And that's what he's asking us to do. to be the doers of good, and to not give up trying to do that good for other people. I know it's tiring. You know, I know a number of you do those things as well. And I know a number of you, in helping others, you get tired helping other people. And he says, don't give up. Don't stop. Keep going. We will receive a reward for that.